In this video we're going to look at how to spot and translate ablative absolutes. The most useful thing for spotting an ablative absolute will be the commas that surround it. Ablative absolutes are always distinct from the sentences in which they find themselves, and they're separated by commas. The other thing you'll find is, well, they're ablative absolutes. So they start with an ablative and they finish with an ablative. You'll also find that they contain participles. My first one, I have a past participle passive. I know this because I can add ion to the ending to make an English word, conviction. My second example, the nt in the middle of it, tells me I have a present participle active. And the last example, the you are, tells me that I have a future participle active. So let's look at translating. First example, I've got commas, I've got a PPP, and I've got ablatives. So I have an ablative absolute. The formula that I'm always going to start with an ablative absolute is after X was wide. So in this sentence, my first translation, it will be Caesar, after the enemy were conquered, returned home. Now I can go a step further here. You can't always, but in this example, I'm fairly sure that it was Caesar who actually did the conquering. So, because English prefers active to passive, I'm going to go a step further and say Caesar, having conquered the enemy, returned home. You can't always do that, but it's often a better translation. If you don't know that Caesar conquered the enemy, if it was someone else who did it, then you cannot translate it like that, and you have to stick with after X was wide. In my second example, I still have an ablative absolute, but in this case, my verb, my PPP, regressis, ion, regression, my verb regressis is from the deponent verb regredior. And I know that a deponent verb, although it looks passive, is always translated active. So in this case, I'm not going to translate it after X was wide. I'm going to translate it after X wide. So my sentence here, Caesar, after the enemy, went back. Oh, I'm not sure why it says the river. I've missed that off. Let's cross that out. After the enemy went back, returned home. So because it's a deponent verb, I translate it actively. Otherwise, after X was wide is how I translate an ablative absolute with a past participle. If I have a present participle, NT, there's my commas, there's my ablatives. If I have a present participle, I'm going to translate my present participle ablative absolute as while X was ying. So Caesar, while the enemy were following, returned home. Now once again, while X was ying is a good way of thinking about the translation to start with, but there might be a better way of saying this in English. So instead of saying while the enemy were following, well, I think it might sound better if I said with the enemy following. Caesar, with the enemy following, returned home. Again, start with while X was ying and then just tweak it to make a better English translation. My final participle phrase is going to have a future participle in it. So this is an ablative absolute, commas around it, ablative at the beginning, at the end, using a future participle. These are by far the least common of all ablative absolutes, and I have a formula for it with x about to y. About to because it's future. So in this sentence, Caesar, with the enemy about to attack the Allies, hurried from the camp. Again, with x about to y is my basic translation. I might want to think of a better way of saying that. Well, I think a slightly better way of saying it would be when the enemy were about to attack the Allies. So I can change it. You'll notice in all three of the examples that I've used, I never turned it into a main clause. I never turned the participle into a main verb. And it's a very good rule in Latin translation to keep participles subordinate. Never turn them into main verbs because they're not main verbs. So to summarize, if you remember the three formulas after x was y'd, while x was y'ing, and with x about to y, you should be able to translate all ablative absolutes.